Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher tidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Grateful that you're here with us. Let us also take a moment of silent prayer as we link our hearts and our thoughts with those who are hurting in Israel and the innocent members of the Palestinian people and the Israeli people who are caught up in a terrible war. So we'll take a moment of silence. Thank you. Amen. Thank you, everyone. So once again, hello, welcome back. I apologize for the delay. Technology, not my friend this morning. Staying here in Cincinnati, Ohio. So I'm remote teaching, but grateful that we can all be together in this virtual space. The lesson that we're going to explore today pertains to a Jewish notion called pidyon shevuyim. Pidyon may be a word that is familiar from a ritual, maybe even a ritual that some of you have performed when a firstborn male came into your household. Pidyon haben means redemption of the son. It involves paying 5 shekels to the nearest Levite, and sometimes that gets extended to a synagogue or a rabbi or another Jewish official, so as to redeem a male child from priestly service. This is a biblical notion that goes all the way back to the book of Numbers, chapter 3, I believe, where in lieu of the Levites, or in lieu of every firstborn male being conscripted into sacred service, the Levites as a tribe are conscripted to be the religious officials for the biblical Israelite community. And ever since, Jewish families traditionally have paid a redemption price for their non-Levitical kids or their sons. Pidyon means redemption. It literally means to buy back. So the same way we actually, the literal meaning of the word to redeem, as in to redeem a lottery ticket, to exchange for something of equal value. Shevuyim means captives. So pidyon shevuyim means redemption of the captives. It is a core mitzvah or commandment in the Jewish tradition. We're going to be exploring this in light of the hostage crisis of those who were brutally attacked. Many were kidnapped back into Gaza about a week and a half ago. And so we're going to look at how Jewish law, Talmudic and extra-Talmudic literature, both ancient and modern, might weigh in on the Jewish responsibility to redeem captives. As a noteworthy case example, I'm going to just bring up onto screen a related tab here. So this was from Monday's news. Give me a second. Where is my share screen? Oh boy, so many internet struggles today. Okay, Zoom seems to have updated and changed the format. So now I am struggling to be able to share the screen. We're going to have a doozy of a time if I can't share my screen today. Oh, my goodness gracious. Does anyone have a share screen button at the bottom of your Zoom screen?
I do. It shows up.
Mine is not showing up. I have a new button called AI Companion. I have no idea what that will do. It'll probably break the universe. I have mute, stop video security, participants chat. There it is, share screen. Okay. They've reformatted everything. So these things that you learn to do on muscle memory. Okay, so the headline that I wanted you to see from Times of Israel just a couple days ago is the IDF says it killed the former senior Hamas official who was in charge of Gilad Shalit's prisoner file. You may recall that back in 2005, Gilad Shalit, the young IDF soldier, was captured by Hamas and kept captive there in Gaza for 5 years. And you may recall that the fate of Shalit was eventually, after 5 years in captivity, I think in 2010 or 2011, he was exchanged for 1,027 Palestinians being held in Israeli prisons, many of whom had been convicted of murder and terrorism and collaboration with terrorist enterprises. So we have, in recent-ish memory, examples of Israel's extraordinary efforts to redeem captives who have been taken captive by terrorist entities. And not surprisingly, Jewish law has a lot to say about this. Jewish law has weighed in on the subject of redeeming captives from the very first. What I'd like to begin, though, a lot of the lesson materials, I have to give some extra special acknowledgement to the Florence Melton Center for Adult Jewish Learning, which assembled a lot of these texts and the various analyses that I've had the ability to study this week as we look at the kind of conversation among traditional texts. Melton invites us into a conversation that begins not with Talmud, but actually with a later source, with the Rambam, with Mishneh Torah, the greatest Jewish legal work by the brilliant Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, or Rambam. You may know him as Maimonides. So we're talking about 13th century Spanish commentator, fled Spain, went to North Africa, actually fled Islamic extremism in his home country, and eventually settled first in Fez and then in Cairo, and eventually was buried in Eretz Israel. So we're looking at the Rambam, Mishneh Torah, the section called Hilchot Matnot Aniyim, which means the laws pertaining to how we supply the poor, how we take care of the poor in our community. But under that larger banner, we have sections devoted to Maimonides' interpretation or read on a summary of Jewish law on how we handle captives. This is chapter 8. I'm going to bring it up first in Hebrew. Don't be intimidated by what you see on your screen. I will. Here we go. Okay, so can everyone see the Hebrew up on your screen there? It should, be visible to you. Okay, great. So I'm going to just start a little bit, and then we're going to look at the corresponding English. Maimonides wrote Mishneh Torah, which literally means a second Torah, which is a fairly chutzpahdik title to call your own work of interpretive legal literature a second Torah, but that's exactly what Maimonides thought this would be for the Jewish community, that this would be a handy-dandy summary of Jewish law and practice, not nearly as voluminous as the Babylonian Talmud, and streamlined, edited, and presented in concise, easy-to-read Hebrew so that even people who were not particularly Jewish literate could grasp the basics of the what of Jewish law, how we live Jewish lives. So it really is one of the great medieval law codes. It is entirely indebted to the Babylonian Talmud, though, in its content, in what it endeavors to present. So here we are looking at Maimonides. Rambam Mishneh Torah. Okay. Pidyon shevuyim. So again, these important words that introduce the subject. Pidyon shevuyim, meaning the redemption of captives. Kodem lefarnasat aniyim. Kodem means comes before or takes precedence over, providing for the poor. So they're talking about what mitzvot or commandments, obligations are incumbent upon the Jewish community. The redemption of captives takes precedence over furnishing for the poor, and lichsutan, which means clothing them. So people who are, presumably indigent, they're still talking about the responsibilities of the Jewish community to the poor. Ve'en lecha mitzvah rabbah, and you have no greater mitzvah, kamo pidyon shevuyim, than redeeming the captives. Sheha shavui, for the captive, harehu, he, or the captive, bichlal hare'evim, is included in the category of the hungry, the hatzmeim, the thirsty, uvichlal ha'erumim, and those who have no clothes, the naked, v'omed basakanat nefashot, and even more, literally it says he stands with his life in danger. So this is the essential teaching here, that the mitzvah of redeeming captives takes precedence even over caring for the poor and the needy, because the captive is in the category of the poor and the needy, being deprived of basic necessities, and also his life is in danger. And because pikuach nefesh, the mitzvah of saving life, is the paramount mitzvah in the kind of informal ranking of Jewish mitzvot by importance, redeeming the captives is on the same plane, is equivalent to, in importance, the mitzvah of saving life. Okay, so that's the general precept here. Now let's switch over to the English language translation provided by our friends at the Melton Center. The ransoming of captives, as I've just translated, takes precedence over the feeding and clothing of the poor. Indeed, there is no greater religious duty than the ransoming of captives, for not only is the captive included in the category of the hungry, the thirsty, and the naked, but his very life is in jeopardy. That's the part that we translated. And now they get into the kind of, cause and effect, or action and consequence. He who turns his eyes away from ransoming him transgresses the following commandments. And we're going to look, and you'll notice that all of the commandments listed below are what the rabbis call deoraita, meaning they are from the Torah. We're going to have actual Torah verses, which, of course, in the eyes of the rabbis, provides the highest level of textual authority for a Jewish precept. Here are the mitzvot, or rather, here are the commandments that one might transgress by failing to fulfill the mitzvah of redeeming the captives. First, do not harden your heart and shut your hand, from Deuteronomy, which is a line about how we are to treat the poor. But remember, Maimonides has begun by establishing a kind of semantic link between the condition of the captive and the Jewish mitzvot pertaining to how we treat the poor. The second, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. That's a line with which you may well be familiar, reading it as we do, not only in its ordinary sequence of Torah readings in the spring, as it comes from Leviticus chapter 19, from Parshat Kedoshim, but also in the Reform movement, we read this passage on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, so it may be familiar. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand by when your neighbor is bleeding. So that's another commandment that would be transgressed were one to not make all efforts to redeem captives. And he shall not rule ruthlessly over him in your sight. We can look at that verse there, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 53. This is an interesting precept, and I think it would be helpful to actually see the biblical context for Leviticus 25:53 from the very end of the book of Leviticus. So I'm just going to call it up on Sefaria. I'm getting the hang of this again. It's been a while. Okay, so this is Leviticus chapter 25, and if you notice here, the context which Maimonides conveniently leaves out is the obligation of an employer to his workers, to his labor. Okay, so let me just go back a little bit. This is talking about, why don't we go all the way back here to the beginning of the section, which is verse 47. If a resident alien among you has prospered, and your kin being in straits comes under that one's authority and is given over to the resident alien among you or to an offshoot of an alien's family, your kin shall have the right of redemption even after being given over. Okay, so the idea here is that imagine that a member of the different tribe or nation or community, the Hittites or some Canaanite tribe, comes to live in an Israelite settlement. and prospers. Okay, so the scenario is being set up is that a non-Jew, they wouldn't have used that terminology, but for our understanding, a non-Jew living in the midst of a Jewish community comes into some success. And then a fellow Israelite is fallen on hard times. And in biblical times, the typical way in which one would seek to remediate the condition of indigency would be to indenture oneself as a servant or a slave in the household of another. So the premise that's being set up here is non-Jewish master, Jewish servant or slave, a Jewish indentured slave, effectively, but by choice, not a person who was forced against one's will to be a captive. But I think you're going to have to kind of like take the nuance in and then disregard a portion of it when you see how Maimonides is using this text to make a case about the redemption of captives, which is, I would say, adjacent thematically to this text, but not directly about it, right? We're not really talking about people who are taken captive in a situation of hostage taking, terrorism, or war. We're really talking about indigency and a Jewish person who ends up as the subject of another person who, relevant to this case, happens to be not an Israelite. Okay, so just returning to the text for a minute to get the full context. If that is the case, it says the Jewish community has the ability to redeem that person. So the rest of the Israelite community can pay a certain fee. I wouldn't use the word ransom, but a redemption price, and buy that person out of his indentured servitude to be a free man, right? So that's what it says. Typically, a brother shall do the redeeming, meaning a person who is actual family or kin, or an uncle's son shall do the redeeming. So if you don't have an actual brother, your uncle will suffice, or your cousin. Anyone in the family who is of the same flesh, so blood relatives, can do the redeeming, or having prospered, your formerly impoverished kin may do the redeeming. So if the person who indentured himself as a slave manages to do okay or do really well, he can buy himself out as soon as he is able. The total shall be computed with the purchaser as from the year of being given over to the other until the Jubilee year. We're not going to get into that. That is part of the larger context of the last part of the book of Leviticus. The price of sale shall be applied to the number of years as though it were for a term as a hired laborer under the other's authority. So basically, you negotiate a buyout price for this indigent or formerly indigent person who is now a slave or an indentured slave to another household, a non-Jewish household. And the price is based on how long that person has been in servitude. That's the basic concept here. Reading on, if many years remain, meaning in the term of one's servitude until the next Jubilee, when there was a full society-wide release of slaves, your kin, meaning the Jewish family member, shall pay back for the redemption in proportion to the purchase price. Don't get too hung up on the details here. And if few years remain until the Jubilee year, so shall it be computed. Payment shall be made for the redemption according to the years involved. That's the main point here. This line here. Don't get too hung up on the details. I just want you to get the general concept. And then finally, we get to the line that Maimonides is quoting. Now, I say all this by way of kind of like modeling for us proper Jewish study practice. If you read a verse that is being cited as a proof text, and the reason for the proof text is not immediately apparent to the reader, to you, you got to go back to the context and see what's happening. Otherwise, it really will leave you in the weeds. You'll be bewildered. One shall not be under the other's authority as a laborer hired by the year. The other shall not rule ruthlessly in your sight. So in other words, you must not allow these non-Jewish slave owners, people who might actually have full authority over a one-time indigent Jewish person, you shall not allow that person to behave in a way that is deemed by the Torah to be ruthless. Now you can see how Maimonides is using that. He's saying, if we fail to redeem captives, then we violate that mitzvah. We violate the mitzvah that says one must not allow a Jewish person to be treated ruthlessly by another. in a condition of, in this case, indentured servitude, but the analogy that the reader is supposed to make is to captivity. All right, we're going to finish this passage on Maimonides, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Then we're actually going to go back into the Talmud to see how these texts can be in dialogue with one another. All right, so that was Leviticus. These are all the mitzvot that one violates by failing to redeem captives. Moreover, meaning if you ignore the requirement to redeem captives, you nullify the following positive commandments. So that all of the ones above are negative commandments, right? Do not harden, do not stand idly by, he shall not rule ruthlessly. 3 negative commandments. Now we're going to look at the positive commandments that are also violated. You must open your hand, again from Deuteronomy 15, which is all about treatment of the poor. And if you want to get really specific, you go back and read Deuteronomy chapters 15 and 16. You'll see it's about not just people who are garden variety poor, but people who are so indigent that they indenture themselves as slaves to others. I know that most of us, having been kind of like fed on a steady diet of Jewish storytelling that puts the experience of slavery at the center of the Jewish narrative, pertinent to our time in Egypt as slaves to a ruthless pharaoh, we are familiar with slavery as a norm described to us from the Torah on up. What many of us may not realize, however, is that the predominant condition of slavery for Israelites living in antiquity was not that we were enslaved by a foreign power, which is part of our narrative, but it's actually historically speculative. There is no archaeological or even secondary textual evidence that Jewish communities, Israelite people, were ever enslaved by Egyptians, period. There is evidence that we were taken in captivity to Babylonia. So that is a slavery experience under foreign rule with which history has corroborating sources, archaeologically and textually. But we do not have archaeological or secondary textual evidence of a massive Israelite enslavement in Egypt, except for what the Torah itself tells us, which is the master story of the Jewish people. It's our story, but it's not corroborated by other sources, not in the Egyptian literature, not in any other ancient Near Eastern literature, and there's no archaeological evidence to support the claim. Having said that, the experience of being slaves is deeply embedded in the Israelite consciousness, and one hypothesis that I happen to support is that the way in which Israelites actually knew slavery was as debtors, or people who had racked up so much financial obligation to another that the only recourse they had was to become indentured slaves, likely in an Israelite household, even though what is being described in Leviticus is an Israelite enslaved in a foreigner's household. All of which, by the way, only gives Maimonides the textual support he needs to make an analogy to people who are taken captive. Okay, we're going to just continue on just a couple paragraphs further, a couple sentences further. So you must open your hand, bracket, to the needy, to the poor. Let him live by your side as your kinsman, another case of indentured servitude that is referenced in Leviticus 25. Love your neighbor as yourself, or love your fellow as yourself, a familiar phrase, but interesting to see how Maimonides is applying it. Rescue those taken off to death, which is, from Proverbs, which is kind of a poetic wisdom literature. Not clear whether this was to be taken literally, but Maimonides is recontextualizing this poetic wisdom phrase to mean something pertinent to the Jewish obligation to redeem captives, and many other admonitions like these. In other words, Maimonides is saying, hey, study the Torah, study the Bible, and you'll see many, many places in which it is a positive mitzvah to redeem people from captivity. To sum up, there is no religious duty greater than the ransoming of captives. So that's how Maimonides gets around to his point. Let's pause here, because that was a very, very long discussion of one influential rabbi's take on the fact that redeeming captives is paramount among Jewish obligations. Questions, thoughts, comments? All right, hearing none, that means Maimonides is perfectly clear. Everybody's following. Yeah, Aaron.
How do you make the distinction, though, in the context of what we're talking about between saving the one life and then risking thousands more if saving life is the utmost importance?
Bingo. Great. Now you're thinking like a rabbi. You're always thinking like a rabbi, Aaron. This is and I mean that as a compliment. Other people, like a non-rabbi who says you're thinking like a rabbi, you may not be sure whether she or he means that as a compliment. I always mean it as a compliment. We're going to get to that. That will actually be the heart of our study today. Audrey, unmute.
Okay. They talked about an alien. In other words, and you're specifying that it's a non-Jew. Could it possibly be a Jew from a different tribe?
Really interesting. Possibly. You know, that of the many things that scholars of the Hebrew Bible do not agree on, one of them is who exactly is meant by the following terms: resident, alien, sojourner, stranger. Like, these are all terms that the Bible uses and uses frequently, but no one, to my knowledge, has definitively identified, has provided a consistent working definition of how exactly the Israelite community meant for those terms to be understood in their time and in their context. So what I'm giving you is the kind of where the majority of biblical interpreters cluster their kind of agreement. The basic agreement is that when the term alien, or ger, I think is the term used in the Mishneh Torah here, is used, what is meant is a non-Jew.
Thank you.
Or non-Israelite. But again, there's no definitive proof that that's how it was meant. And it's entirely plausible, as you seem to suggest, that in biblical times, we might have identified primarily or even exclusively by tribe, and that we were a Judahite or a Benjaminite or a Naphthalite, far more, concretely in the consciousness of the community than this idea of an Israelite amalgamated, unified community. There is a lot to suggest that it took a long time for Israelite identity to coalesce as a kind of cohesive nation, as opposed to the smaller tribal identities. Think of it as like, well, am I a New Yorker or am I an American? Depends on who I ask. When I'm in Cincinnati, I definitely feel like a New Yorker. It's funny. I walked into a men's clothing store this week, and somebody said, I bought a pair of pants, and he's like, I said, I could tell from the way you're dressed that you're not from around here. He said, it's like, you're from New York or LA? And I'm like, yeah, I'm from New York, and I got this jacket in LA. So, yeah. So that's my tribe. My tribe is New York. My people are the Jewish people, especially this week. Russell.
Well, thank you for this very interesting passage and interesting discussion. I don't think you'll accuse me of thinking like a rabbi, but I'd love to be accused of thinking like a poet. And my question is, have the rabbis interpreted this metaphorically? We often, for example, read the story of captivity in Egypt, the one that we're not sure factually ever actually happened, as a poetic metaphor for enslaved thinking. Have the rabbis viewed this particular passage as a metaphor for rescuing people from their moral or intellectual darkness?
The only person I know who would have done that is Maimonides himself, but not in Mishneh Torah. It's interesting. Maimonides he wrote a lot, but he wrote two kind of like mega works that continue to be extraordinarily influential in Jewish life. Mishneh Torah, this great code of Jewish law. He will, in his other masterwork, which is called Moreh Nevuchim, or the Guide to the Perplexed, which is a work of religious philosophy, written not in Hebrew, by the way. So Mishneh Torah is written in this very basic Hebrew that even people with a fairly rudimentary grasp of Hebrew can generally understand quite well. It was written for the masses, for the hoi polloi. He meant it for the common person, just to kind of go about Jewish life and know what's what. Here's what I'm allowed to do. Here's what I'm not allowed to do. Boil it down. No Talmudic arguments, no getting into the weeds over varying viewpoints. Maimonides himself says, I'm going to present myself as the authority on all of these issues. All you have to do is read my book, and it'll be like you have a second Torah, a Mishneh Torah in your hands. But in his other work, this work of religious philosophy, which he intended for his elite students, it is deeply influenced by Maimonides' own studies of Aristotle and Greek philosophy. It is written in Judeo-Arabic, so it was not written for the common person. It's in a very, very elevated language. I cannot read Moreh Nevuchim, not easily anyway. It's a very hard book to read, even in Hebrew translation, which is how most Jewish scholars read Moreh Nevuchim. Moreh Nevuchim is filled with metaphorical thinking of the sort that you describe, Russell. I do not know if specifically he takes up the idea of redemption of captives as kind of one can make an analogy to, or an allegory out of, or a metaphor to captivity from enslaved thinking or being, though I wouldn't put it past him. That is the kind of thing that Maimonides does, and of course has its own legitimate place within the vast annals of Jewish thought and writing. But to my knowledge, first of all, it is important to say that when Maimonides is talking about the redemption of captives here in Mishneh Torah, he literally means redeeming people who have actually been taken captive. That's the most important thing to affirm. Secondly, if he did do that, or if anyone else did do that, as you described, I don't know of it. Doesn't mean it's not out there. Okay, Judy Gross.
Well, the op-ed in today's paper, which I'm sure many people here have read, the safety of the hostages must come first.
Mm-hmm.
And the point of Mikhail Menakin is, who are we when this, hopefully one day we will come to some better situation. Who are we as a community if we don't act in a way that would be saving the hostages as the hostages come first? He quotes Maimonides, by the way. It's exactly what you're saying.
Oh, brilliant. Maybe somebody can find it, link it, put it in the chat window so that people can take that with them and not read it during class, but afterward.
I'll do it afterwards. But anyway, who are we?
That's really
the question.
So relevant. Thanks, Judy. Karen and Ed.
Well, first of all, thank you for this discussion, which is really addressing what's at the forefront of all of our minds right now. I wondered two things. One, the passages that you referred to do not really discuss anything in the way of there's no price that is too high for that redemption. And I mean, I don't know if there's any context there. I mean, the whole thing with Gilad Shalit, we released 1,000 prisoners, including just some of the most horrible criminals, terrorists, etc. Second, that's one point or question. And the other is, how do we think that the Hamas and Hezbollah are aware of these tenets in the Jewish religion, and they know that we won't stop at anything to release captives?
I'm sure that they do. I'm sure that's part of this, is that they're well aware that and they don't even need, familiarity with Jewish text or tradition. They have plenty of evidence from Jewish history and Israeli history on how Israel has set a precedent for the extreme lengths to which the state of Israel will go to redeem its captives, both the living and the dead, by the way. The efforts that Israel will make and has made to bring back its soldiers and its civilians, if taken by the enemy, that's all the evidence they would need. I would not put it past any of the masterminds of the heinous crimes that have been committed against Israelis, civilians and soldiers alike, but civilians in particular. I would not put it past any of the masterminds that they are familiar with the lengths to which the Jewish state will go. On the subject of when is too much, that's the same question as Aaron has, so we should move along and make sure we get to all of that, but I want to acknowledge Michelle and then my folks.
I wish that I could think as poetically, as think both politically and philosophically, but let me at least respond to Russ's comment. It is not as far an analogy, but for those of us old enough to have participated in the efforts to get Russian Jews out of Russia, get them permission and free, as it were, the refuseniks, that was and is often contextualized in context of freeing the captives.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for remembering that. That for me, the plight of Soviet Jewry and the extraordinary efforts of the global Jewish community to redeem our brothers and sisters behind the Iron Curtain, I think is one of the great stories of our time, our shared time. It certainly was formative for my Jewish identity, as that was really the major Jewish justice cause that unfolded in my formative years of youth. And I even was paired with a Soviet boy with whom I corresponded in letters that were heavily censored by the Soviet, by the powers in the Soviet Union at the time, for my bar mitzvah. As part of my mitzvah project was actually outreach to a Soviet Jew. Thank you, Michelle. Mom and Dad, you're on.
I don't want to drive us astray here, but what comes to my mind is if it is such a terrible thing to be a captive, if that's like your life is in peril, how much more terrible is it to sell somebody into captivity? And what comes to mind is how Joseph's brothers sold him into captivity, and after that, why would they ever merit any kind of blessing at all?
I don't think that takes us too far down, a sidetrack here. I will simply say that the Torah's relationship with slavery is, I think, one of the master themes of our master story. Is, ultimately, if you want to boil it down to one sentence, if the Torah tells us anything about slavery, it says, we are slaves or servants, which, by the way, there's no different word in biblical Hebrew. It's oved. An oved, which also means a worker, a laborer, a servant, a slave, which I think is itself telling that we don't have different words for an employee, a laborer, a servant, an indentured servant, and a slave. What differentiates one from the other is the conditions under which one is kept. And so ultimately, the Torah makes the strong case that we are all servants of Adonai, right? The only master is God, and we are all God's children, and equally so. Israelite, foreigner, everyone made in the image of God, everyone equal, love your neighbor as yourself, and so forth. All of the mitzvot that flow from that concept. But having said that, there's also a comprehensive, very detailed discussion throughout the Torah and the Bible of the fact that, yes, that's nice in concept, but in the real world, we are subject to the depredations of human nature and the requirements of living in a functioning economy. And throughout most of human history, certainly throughout all of Israelite history, the condition of both slave owning and being a slave was so widespread. It was, not aberrant, it was the norm. And so the regulations that are placed on the institution, particularly for Jews, were not to abolish slavery. I would say that, contrary to what many of us like to believe, and frankly, contrary to predominant Jewish responses, for instance, to Black, African slavery in the United States, which many Jews were part of abolitionist movements, not all. Many Jews were also slave owners, and many rabbis in the South even defended the institution of slavery, at many times appealing to the Bible itself, saying, look right here, the Bible itself authorizes slavery. But the predominant Jewish strain has been anti-slavery, but I would not suggest in any way, shape, or form that the Israelite mindset or national literature, that is to say, our Torah and Tanakh, is an abolitionist literature. Rather, it tries to regulate the institution of slavery so that it is not carried out with cruelty, and so that it is not imposed permanently on a person, right? So the idea is that slavery, the slave is humanized so as not to be, quote unquote, mistreated. Now, we, from our 21st century American vantage point, can easily take issue with that framework and say, no, it's categorically wrong or evil for another person to be in, for one person to be in bondage to another. But that's a convenient viewpoint that I think is an unfair and anachronistic imposition on the conditions of the time in which this literature arose. Does that make sense? Is that at least a reasonable way of getting into your question without getting all the way into your question?
I think so.
Okay.
I don't need to drag it astray.
Yeah, take it up and then we're going to move forward. And you have to unmute yourself, Kathy, before you speak.
Hi. Yeah, I really identified with Russell's comment, and what I would say, and I was also very struck. This is the first time that I had heard that we were not slaves to Egypt and the pharaohs. So I would say
maybe we were and maybe we weren't.
Maybe we were, maybe we weren't. But I would say that slavery, the term slavery, while it can be very concrete, is also metaphorical in the Bible, and there are many ways to be enslaved.
Yes.
You can be enslaved by other people. You can be indentured by other people, and in some cases, be grateful for that.
Right.
You know, and but we're often enslaved by our own ideas and the human condition. Right now, the world is enslaved by this hatred, and it is reaching proportions that are without bounds, and that is the kind of enslavement that really right now is most disconcerting to me.
Thank you. I mean, my inclination as a teacher is to follow the first rule of improv, which is when your dialogue partner says something, you say yes, and, as opposed to no, but. So yes, Kathy, and for Maimonides, for the Jewish authorities, for the Torah itself, again, kind of playing off of your thoughts and Russell's, there's nothing in Jewish tradition that would invalidate a metaphorical way of approaching these texts. And in fact, that is the art and beauty of Midrash. However, right now, we have close to 200 actual human beings who are captives of Hamas. So we have to take this text, I think, in the more literal frame if we want to understand what it's telling us about the urgent crisis in front of us. Okay, Arlene, one more comment, but then I really want to get back to text.
Okay.
Yep.
One of the positive things that happened this week, I thought, unfortunately, was the murdering of that 6-year-old little boy with Palestinian background. But at the funeral service, to see rabbis and Muslim leaders standing side by side, supporting one another and expressing the horror about what happened to this child, this innocent child. And I'm hoping that we're going to see more and more people standing together. Jews did that when Blacks first were concerned about their freedom and about their ability to function in today's world. 50 years ago, how many Jews stood up for Blacks? So let's hope that maybe one of the things that will start to happen is that people will see that you can be cohesive and you can be supportive.
Thank you.
Right now, it doesn't seem that way.
Yeah, no, and I don't know. I think that the numerous calls and kind of distress that I'm hearing from students on college campuses would suggest that the kind of allyship from other minority communities is in short supply right now. So I both affirm your hopefulness and also share the things that are weighing heavily on me right now. Okay, back to text. Here we go. So we won't need as much time to unpack the second paragraph from Maimonides, because I really do want to get to some Talmud and affirm that we're here to study Talmud. If the people of the city, Maimonides continues, and you can see this is the very next paragraph. So that we looked at paragraph 10 under this section about redeeming captives. This is the adjacent, the sequential paragraph. If the people of the city, having collected money for the building of a synagogue, find themselves confronted with a matter of religious duty, they must divert the money to the latter. So now that's a general precept. And this is really directly relevant, for instance, even to WRT, is we have a lot of needs right now, and WRT is making every effort to direct whatever discretionary funds we can toward our sister communities and toward Israelis in need, and toward those organizations that are providing medical relief for human beings who are affected by the conflict, Jewish and Israeli, Palestinian alike. So most Israeli medical centers, for instance, will treat anyone who is wounded, regardless of their national or ethnic identity. WRT has some resources to direct in that way. And Maimonides would suggest that if you have the resources, even if they were originally intended for a different synagogue use or purpose, you need to divert them. Reading on, if they had already bought stones and beams, they may not sell them in order to fulfill the religious duty. So if you already have like the materials you need to build your synagogue, you purchase them with synagogue funds, you can't sell them back to raise money for some other religious responsibility like redeeming captives. Unless, whoops, I spoke too soon, unless it is for the redemption of captives. So even that, you can again, showing the lengths to which a Jewish community can and should go to redeem its captives. Even if they have already brought in the stones and set them up and carved the beams and thus made everything ready for construction, they must nevertheless sell everything, but only if for the ransoming of captives. So you can't use it for other Jewish religious purposes. If, however, they have already completed the erection of the building, they may not sell the synagogue, but they should rather make a new collection from the community for the redemption of those captives. So that's a fairly self-evident teach from Maimonides, again, highlighting the importance in the kind of rank order of mitzvot incumbent upon Jewish people and Jewish communities. Now let's, what I want us to do now is move ahead sequentially in the order of text that we've arranged, or that Melton has arranged for us, but let's move backward in history. So we're going to start with a Mishnah from Gittin. Gittin, as the name suggests, is actually about the giving and acquiring of a get, a writ of divorce. But as is the way of Mishnah and Talmud, often material that might appear to the casual reader to be extraneous is included under a headline about something entirely other. So everyone can see this line here, Mishnah Gittin, chapter 4, verse 6. In podin et ha-shevuyim, yoter al kedei demehen mipnei tikun ha'olam. This is a really interesting phrase. Captives may not be ransomed for more than their value for the sake of the social order. So there you are, Aaron and Karen. Direct response, though compact, to your question. Captives may not be ransomed for more than their value for the sake of the social order. Now, as is usually the case with Mishnah, it says a lot in very, very few words, which is why the Talmud comes along to enlarge the meaning of the Mishnah. I want to break this down. In podin et ha-shevuyim, you may not redeem captives, yoter al kedei demehen. Now, literally, idiomatically, it says for more than their value. The literal translation means more or more than that, more than their blood. Kedei demehen, more than their actual blood is worth. This is another very difficult phrase. Mipnei, because tikkun ha'olam, because of tikkun olam. Now, again, I think any of us who are deeply steeped in Reformed Jewish life in the 21st century have a right to be completely perplexed by this statement. The first thing that needs to be unperplexed here is the use of the phrase tikkun ha'olam. This is one of the very first places in which tikkun olam is used in actual Jewish writing, as opposed to the way it is kind of figuratively or idiomatically used in most Jewish settings, particularly non-Orthodox Jewish settings today. In non-Orthodox Jewish settings today, and for the last many decades, tikkun olam has been kind of a stand-in for Jewish obligations of social justice and social action. That is how it is used at WRT, and that is consistent with how it is used throughout our movement, and I think in the conservative movement as well. And even these days, if I were to go and have a beer with my buddy Jonathan Morgenstern and talk about, so what is your congregation doing for tikkun olam, we'd be speaking the same language of social justice, social action. That is not what is meant here. Tikkun literally means repair or restoration, but can also mean kind of building or establishing. Ha'olam literally means the world. And in this case, as is consistent with most contemporaneous Jewish texts, so we're going back the better part of 2,000 years to the Mishnah. 2,000 years ago, throughout the period of the Mishnah, the Talmud, the rabbinic period, tikkun olam meant something very different. Tikkun ha'olam pre-Kabbalah, by the way, pre-13th century, so all of the Mishnah and Talmud is many, many, many centuries of writing, but it's long before Jewish mysticism comes along in the way we recognize it through the Kabbalah and the Zohar, where tikkun olam comes to mean something different, something cosmic. In Mishnah and Talmud, tikkun olam usually means something like the social order. So what is being said here is if you pay more than a captive is worth, and we're going to have to get into analyzing, well, what does that mean? How do you know? What is a captive worth? Right? And don't we have Jewish teachings that say the life of one life is equivalent to the life of the entire world? So how do you put a price on a human life? Nevertheless, at face value, the Mishnah says, you may not redeem captives for more than their value today for the sake of tikkun ha'olam, the social order. Now, I'm going to wait a few minutes to take questions because I'd like us to see how the Talmudic literature itself unpacks this very difficult text. Short, easy to understand, hard to understand, right? Easy to translate, but very hard to understand. So moving forward, this is the text. We're going to see what happens next. I'm just going to kind of skim forward. Okay. So this is now the Babylonian Talmud. You can see right here, Masechet Gittin. So it's the same tractate of the Talmud, commenting exactly on the passage above. And if you're familiar with language here, you might recognize that we've kind of moved into an Aramaic language here. So it's ibaye leho, hai mipnei tikkun ha'olam, mishum duchka tzibora, hu, o dilma mishum de la ligvuru velaitu tefei ta shema. Okay, so we'll read on a little bit. I actually broke the sentence where a period was not. So let's see how they translate it here. The question was raised, does this social order derive from concern over imposing too heavy a burden, which is the Aramaic phrase duchaka de tzibora, on the community, or from concern lest we encourage, and that's the de la ligvrevu, bandits, to kidnap people and offer them for ransom? All right, let me try and unpack this. The rabbis identified that there are two threats to the social order if one pays more than a captive is actually worth. Now, again, I know you're already thinking, well, isn't that subjective? So yeah, keep thinking that. Let's keep moving on, though. Let's talk about these two different elements that the Talmud identifies. The Talmud identifies two problems with paying more than a captive is worth in the effort to redeem him from captivity. They are, one, that it might impose such financial hardship or material hardship on a Jewish community as to imperil the Jewish community that is engaged in the efforts to ransom the captive. And two, it might stimulate the bad guys it might encourage the bad guys to do more of this. In other words, if the enemy realizes that kidnapping is a lucrative business, it will only encourage more kidnapping. This is a huge problem, for instance, in Mexico and a lot of Central America these days because of the way in which cartels have every economic incentive to continue kidnapping people and holding them for ransom. And by the way, often murdering them with their callous disregard for the value of human life. But the point is that in places where kidnapping has become a lucrative business, what disincentive exists for the kidnappers? So there are two issues. One, again, the burden it places on the Jewish community and the way it might actually weaken the Jewish community to go to these extraordinary lengths to redeem captives. And two, and by the way, maybe not just economic, right? So if you talk about Gilad Shalit, redeeming one Israeli soldier for 1,027 Palestinian prisoners, some of whom are dangerous criminals, well, you jeopardize the Jewish community by doing that. You've redeemed your captive, you've fulfilled your mitzvah, but you've incurred a situation where Jewish people in Israel are now less safe because of that prisoner exchange, right? Or that captive exchange. The second one is that you are also teaching the captors, this is good business, right? So that's obviously what the Talmud is wrestling with here. And let's look at just a little bit further in the text to see how it deals with this. Come in here. So Tashma, and that's where I stopped. And that's why I said, oh, I broke across a period. So we're reading this part here. All right, so we've had the two possible interpretations of tikkun ha'olam. What about the social order is being threatened? Option one, the Jewish community is going to be imperiled by the ransoming of captives because you're draining resources or actually making people unsafe. Two, you're teaching the bad guys that this is a good model and they should keep it up. Tashma, that literally means come in here. I've got a story for you, right? The Talmud does this sometimes when it wants to corroborate a point. We've seen the many different ways throughout our study of Talmud. And if you're joining us for the very first time today, welcome. I hope you won't find this study above you or beneath you, but just right. But if you ever have any questions and would like to ask for a little bit more grounding in how the Talmud makes its points, please don't be bashful about chiming in. We're always endeavoring to create a community of study where we can unlock the text and it remains accessible to all, even though it's very difficult material. And you should be commended just for showing up and trying it. So we've seen the way in which when the Talmud wants to corroborate a claim, it often relies on text, right? Maimonides himself does that. He says, well, if you don't redeem the captives, you're violating all sorts of mitzvot. Here are several that are phrased as thou shalt not, what we call mitzvot lo taseh, mitzvot of thou shalt not, or negative mitzvot, as well as the thou shalts, positive mitzvot. So Maimonides uses text to make his point. But the Talmud, in addition to using textual support, will also use anecdotes, what we call ma'asim or maisas. Here's a real story of a real rabbi, the rabbis will say, that can help us illustrate the point we're trying to make. So that's what's going to happen here. They're going to bring a so-called real story of a real rabbi, even if it's folklore. That's the idea. That's the hermeneutic, right? That's how the rabbis are going to support their claim. So they say, come in here. Levi bar Darga, to Levi bar Darga. So we're going to hear a story about a guy named Levi bar Darga. Parka livrate. So he ransomed his daughter. Okay, livrate. Bitlesar alfe dinare. How much money is that? A dinar is probably familiar to you as a unit of currency in the ancient world. 13,000 gold dinar. Oh, dinare zahav. So he ransomed his daughter for 13,000 dinars. A dinar is not like a peso. 13,000 dinars is a lot of money. That's the point. You need to know that in order to understand the text, he paid an exorbitant sum to redeem his daughter who had been taken as a captive. Okay, reading on, goes on to say, Abaye, Amar Abaye, Abaye said, Uman le malan divirtson chachamim. Avad. Sorry, I'm not as good with Aramaic. So, well, how do we know that he acted with the consent of the sages? In other words, when this rich guy had his daughter stolen and kidnapped, and then he went and paid 13,000 dinars, who says that he did that with the permission of the rabbis of his community? He might have just gone and done it. Like if he had the resources, he's a free-thinking Jew, he can do whatever he wants. So Abaye, one of the more noted Amoraim, or later sages of the Gemara, of the Talmud, says, well, wait a second. Before we view the actions of this guy as authoritative, as a precedent that we should follow, do we know that he was acting with the consent of the rabbis of the time? And he goes to say, perhaps he acted against the will of the sages, right? And that's this line here. Dilma shelo virtzona chamim avad. Right? Maybe he was doing it without the consent of the sages. Now, this is very Talmudic because there is no resolution to this debate. All right. So in Tractate Gittin, we have an example. We know the basic premise is you have to go to extraordinary lengths to redeem captives. However, you'll see that the Mishnah puts a limiting condition on it. Yeah, but you can't redeem captives for more than they're worth, lest one of two bad things happen. You jeopardize the Jewish community, and you tell the bad guys that this is good business. Then you have a case example, right? Here's a guy who paid an exorbitant sum. So presumably, in other words, the example comes to prove that, well, how much is too much, right? Here's a guy who paid, what for many people would have been multiple life savings just to redeem his daughter. And another rabbi comes in, Abaye says, oh, hang on a second. I'm not sure you can make a precedent out of this because maybe he did it without rabbinic authority. And then that's the end of the discussion, and there is no resolution to it. So now here's where you get to chime in with your thoughts or ideas. Judy, you unmuted, so maybe you want to speak.
Yeah, I just quickly, this is his daughter. This is not a third party. This is a first party. And what would you not do for your child? I mean, this is hard to weigh in any context that's for the community.
Right.
You'll do anything, and the community be damned. Anyway, that's a different.
Right. So now we, by the way, have hundreds of Israeli parents who are in this position.
Right.
And yet at the same time, most of them also recognize that even if they could, they may not want to jeopardize other Jews.
Can I just add a personal statement? When
Please.
we got together for Yoel's memorial, and he asked us, he had 100 candles out, and he asked us to come up singly to light a candle. I lit a candle for somebody. That was such an effective way to connect. Was the person I lit the candle for a child? Was it a grandmother? So it's so complex and so deep.
And these mitzvot, I want to make it clear, these are mitzvot that are not incumbent. Like, this is real right now. We're studying Talmud about something that is happening to us. It's not happening to Israel, right? All of these mitzvot, they are incumbent on the Jewish people. So, and those who, by the way, associate themselves with the Jewish people. I recognize that not everybody in this room this morning may be Jewish or may have been born Jewish, but we're all in this together. These mitzvot pertain not just to people who are Israeli, they pertain to the Israelite people. That is our nation. Thank you, Judy. Let's hear from Aaron and Rob, please.
So I think my first point is the Talmud only talks about this in financial value, which I think makes it a little bit harder to understand, because in my mind, they don't answer the question I asked in terms of a life for a life.
Get there too, by the way.
Okay. The other problem that I have with this entire, which not the Talmud, not Maimonides, just the conversation, is separating something that is still theoretical, right? Like, I bet when they did the prisoner swap 5 years ago or 10 years ago, they were still hoping this would never happen. And so you're faced with an actual versus a theoretical. Well, I can 100% save this one life, and I'm just going to cross my fingers that I don't have to, there's not going to be a price to pay for that later. I think that makes the what is too much really hard to define.
Yes, thank you.
Please.
Judy Lass.
Yes, I've been thinking about this thing since we began, and it seemed to me So I was listening. I remember I am my brother's keeper. And I think when we say that, we don't necessarily mean it literally. I think that these people who are hostages and people in general who need to be cared for are part of the Jewish community, part of Israel. And if we're part of Israel, then we have an obligation that starts way back in Genesis that we need
last
to do
week's Torah
something.
portion, by the way, the week of the attack, the same Torah portion contained that great unanswered master question of our faith, which is, am I my brother's keeper? I think we all know that the Jewish response to that is a resounding yes. That everything else in the Torah comes to say, oh, you certainly are.
For me personally, that's the entire thing. Yep. We are, and so we are responsible for people who need our help.
Thank you. Audrey, Russell.
With all due respect to you as a rabbi, the passage that you read, that you highlighted, why did they need the rabbi's permission to take care of their daughter?
Well, the interesting question is, I'm not sure they say they do, right? I mean, one rabbi thinks it's important to have secured rabbinic permission, but the fact that the Talmud ends the conversation there and does not provide an answer would suggest that, well, the community may not have agreed. That, but on the other hand, it can't be good for our people if wealthy folks are given an unfair advantage to redeem their captives. As Judy says, what wouldn't one do for one's daughter? But do you want to be in a situation where the mitzvah being incumbent on the entire Jewish community can be selectively utilized by people with greater resources?
But it doesn't say that this wealthy person wouldn't have done the same for somebody else's child.
It does not say, full stop. Right. Russ. Oh, unmute.
Further to the preceding point, my thought of what I find moving about this is the person who spent a lot of money to redeem his daughter, even if that is what the market would bear, made it harder for everybody else to redeem their captives thereafter. And what this is telling us is that all of these decisions need to be taken, whether you're doing it with rabbinical authority or not. You need to take this decision with the people, in the whole people, the whole community combined.
Thank you.
This person who is a captive of represents all of us, if you will.
That's right. It's not just that family member's responsibility. The way in which we are, as I said before, in so many ways, we are all responsible for these captives that are being held in Gaza right now. I think the tradition would affirm that, and therefore any decision that one person or one family makes to redeem one's own captive actually has a kind of a direct effect, not just on the person in captivity, but on the entire Jewish people. Thank you. Mom and Dad.
This kind of reflects back on what Aaron was saying at the time of Gilad Shalit's release, that that somehow the Israelis were hoping that these 1,020 some odd released prisoners would fulfill the obligation to bring back the captive at any price. But I think it might have been an object lesson and a price that was too much to pay, for all we know. And it's not beyond the realm of possibility that some of these 1,000 people are now commanders in Hamas, that they may have actually been in the assault team and murderers of Jews.
Right.
And maybe this was, in fact, a price that was too high to pay to redeem this one captive. I don't pretend to have an answer to that, and I don't mean to sound, cruel or callous about it, but it's something that we've got to come to grips with.
That's So I'm gonna say one thing, because since we started 10 minutes late, those who are able to stay an additional 10 minutes, I hope you will. I do have to end by 11:55. The thing I want to emphasize here is that there's a lot more text on this, that the Talmud actually goes into great depth about, well, what about a husband redeeming his wife? And what are the proper lengths? In other words, the Talmud breaks this down in a granular way and says, well, there are lots of different considerations depending on who's been taken captive and that person's relationship with family. It also says there are parts of this section in Gittin, in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud, that I had thought we might have time for, but I want to use our time as strategically as possible and keep it tightly focused on the crisis unfolding in front of us. It actually goes on to say that the Jewish community may have reason to go above and beyond to redeem Torah scholars. Now, and before you laugh and say, well, of course the rabbi likes that, the Jewish people, the Jewish community actually exemplified that statement through the Herculean efforts that diaspora Jewish communities made to rescue rabbis and scholars from the Shoah. That people like Abraham Joshua Heschel and more were rescued from Nazi Germany, from Nazi, where they surely would have been sent to their deaths. So the Jewish community sometimes says, well, this person has a higher value for the Jewish people, therefore we can expend greater efforts and resources to redeem him or her. That's all in the text that we're not going to get to today. We are going to look at one more text, though, that I want to make sure we get to. So quickly, comments from Joe, Joyce, and Arlene. Just unmute, Joe. Yep, you're unmuted.
Okay, I just wanted to,
Yep,
I just wanted to thank your father, Doug, and Russell for making points that I was thinking about, but I'm just imagining how difficult a decision it may be on a group, on a country basis, on a government basis, and also a personal basis of how to go about attacking people who are innocent, attacking a country or an area that most of the people are, except for the people who run the place, the Hamas, are innocent, and making that decision to bomb or attack or run, and what the price that you're having to pay in a situation like that is.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that.
No, there's no answer.
Right. Thank you. Joyce. Oh, unmute. So sorry. You have to unmute and go back to where you started. Thank you. Nope, still muted. Might be the little microphone key in the lower left of your screen. All right, while you're working on that, Arlene, we'll hear from you.
Okay. Well, I think Hamas has already set up the precedent of saying that they will do an exchange, possibility, for the hostages and some Palestinian prisoners. So that's in place. Whether that will even be a point, who knows? Right now, we don't know if that's going to be a bargaining tool at all. But what I think is very sad is that there is no answer to any of these questions that are being raised right now.
That's right.
That no matter what Israel does, it's going to come out in a way where a lot of people are going to be very critical of their actions and will be non-supportive. And that's really the pain. By the way, the book group from Westchester Reformed Temple just finished a book called Opperman. And in it, they talk about what was going on in Nazi Germany and how one particular very wealthy man was imprisoned by the Nazis, and he was let go because they viewed him as a Talmudic scholar.
Yeah, that book came out over 20 years ago, actually, The Oppermans. I'm going to put it in the chat window for people's reference. Joyce,
well,
I think
it was
you managed
written in the 1930s.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I seem to have joined the 21st century. Going back to what is the value of someone held hostage, and this, I could feel the pain just asking this. We have all those hostages right now. What is the value? We're all kind of thinking we want all the hostages out. Of course we do. What if we can't have all the hostages out?
Right.
Who's worth more?
That's right.
Is a baby worth more? Is a Holocaust survivor worth more?
Right.
Who's worth more?
Right.
How do you
That's right. I mean,
determine such a thing?
For Hamas, it could well be that a foreigner, meaning a non-Israeli, is worth more right now because they can release a foreigner to further sympathy in parts of the world that are already sympathetic to Hamas and saying, look, they're not so bad after all. It's hideous. I mean, I think we see through it, but it's thank you. Yep. Your anguished response is one that we share. And by the way, as I think I've reminded this class of one thing from the very beginning of when we started studying this literature. If you came to the Talmud looking for clear answers, that's not what you'll get. What you'll get is the critical issues and dialogues of the Jewish tradition. And now we're actually we're immersed in it. We're part of it. We're creating it. Okay, Kathy, make a comment, and then I want to get to the final text that we're going to look at this morning. But you have to unmute.
Okay, here we go. I apologize. So my question is, if it's incumbent on the community to look to the community to make decisions about redemption, the question that I have for you is, how broad is Israel's community right now? Because the repercussions for next steps can go well beyond Israel. So, I mean, Biden was there and and made his comments. We don't need to go, but what are your thoughts? Is this Israel's decision alone?
I would say, look, Israel has its own democratically elected Knesset, its government, formed by coalition. Right now, much to my relief, a wartime unity government has been formed that will, please God, be able to stay together as a government, to cohere, to coalesce, remain a coalition as it prosecutes its war. The incredible division that was tearing Israeli society apart from the inside out over the last year has largely been set aside so that Israelis from the far left to the far right are united right now. I mean, everyone I talk to, my dear friends, not that I have many friends who are extremists in either left or right, but I have friends who would have, voted, in the Peace Now camp and big far lefty. And I have people who are, let's just say, right of center. There's no argument that this Jewish state is united, and by and large, world Jewry is united as well. And it's important to recognize what Theodor Herzl first said, which is that Israel is not the Jewish state so much as it is the state of the Jews. It belongs to the global Jewish community. Its residents make the decisions about governance and policy and who's going to run it. But Israel is the project of the global Jewish people. So I think that's the best way I can answer that. Now, I want to take up what I believe has become the elephant in the room, which is the question not just of the responsibility of Jewish communities to redeem captives, and then the big question mark around, but at what price, where price is usually measured in dollars, right? But we're going to look at a modern halakhic authority, an Orthodox rabbi, I believe still living, who takes up the terrible but important question of, and what about exchanging prisoners for terrorists? So this is Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Halevi Kilav, written in 1983, so written 40 years ago. He writes as follows: furthermore, it seems that nowadays when terrorists declare their desire to kidnap and murder Jews, and in fact act upon these declarations without any compassion for the victims, whether men, women, or children, that releasing terrorists is actual danger and is therefore forbidden, right? Because if it increases danger to the Jewish people, then it actually has a negative net effect on Israel and Jewish people everywhere. And we've seen that Hamas actually has declared days of rage, and that jihad, holy war, is to be enacted on not just Israelis, but on Jews, right? So you're a target, I'm a target. Westchester Reformed Temple is a target. I hate to say these things, but that's how we're treating it. And that's why our security posture has been augmented throughout the crisis. This is true even according to those who maintain that the prohibition is based on the burden imposed on the community. That's what we looked at from Gittin, Mishnah, and Talmud, the prohibition against redeeming captives because of the burden it imposes on the community, since the danger here is tangible and arises immediately upon their release. As soon as you release terrorists back, you've increased danger to Jews and Jewish communities. Added to this is the fact that they joined the forces that battle us from their countries with long-range weaponry, and thus represent a threat even if they don't actually penetrate our borders. So if terrorists go back to Gaza, they assist Hamas in its efforts to harm Jews and the Jewish state. Reading on. Furthermore, their compatriots will not hesitate to act against us, knowing that they don't endanger their lives if they fall captive, since they will be released soon thereafter. In other words, if the bad guys learn that, oh, well, Israel will, we'll be in prison for a while, but Israel isn't going to kill us. Israel does not have a death penalty. On record, the only criminal publicly tried and executed by the state of Israel was Eichmann. And even that continues to tear at the soul of the Jewish people. There are many who believe that it was the right decision, and there are many in Israel who believe it was not the right decision. Be that as it may, Israel does not have the death penalty. You can go to prison for a very long time, even life. But if a criminal learns that, well, as a terrorist, I might end up in an Israeli jail, but then I'll just be bought back, right? So one Gilad Shalit and 1,000 of my buddies and I get to go back home and fire rockets back at Israel. Like if that's what they learn, how is that good for the Jewish people? We are also in a permanent state of war with them, which cannot be halted because of danger to the soldiers. In other words, if you look at this as, well, hang on for a second, the dominant condition of Israel vis-a-vis its enemies is that we are at war, even if it's a cold war, right? Whether it's cold or hot, these are our enemies. And by the way, not for nothing, Israel's enemies believe that civilians are reasonable targets because in Israel, there is no such thing as a civilian. Now, again, I disagree with that, but that is often a logic that is used in the Arab world that justifies terrorism against and capturing and killing civilians, because they say, well, Israel's army is made up of civilians. So everybody either is a soldier, a potential soldier, or a former soldier. Now, again, it's an obnoxious argument. It's a morally shoddy argument. I'm just saying it's an argument. But this rabbinic authority is saying, this modern rabbinic authority is saying, look, we're in war and we can't just stop fighting just because our soldiers are in danger. That's what it means to be Israeli. It therefore seems that it is forbidden to release terrorists and murderers in exchange for captives, not just in exchange of many terrorists for one Jew, but even one for one because of the future danger. Now, of course, this is not the only opinion. So reading on. Lots of analysis, by the way. Another opinion came 7 years later from Rabbi Shmuel Tanchum Rubinstein, releasing terrorists in exchange for captives. As you can see, modern rabbinic authorities, halakhic authorities, have endeavored to, add to this conversation. He says, if we were going to compare the case of releasing terrorists with the law of not ransoming captives beyond their value, which we have seen today, we should permit the release of one terrorist in return for one captive, but not release hundreds of terrorists in exchange for 2 or 3 soldiers in captivity, as their malicious organizations demand. The people have already reacted to the Jibril deal, claiming that the government made a terrible mistake in releasing hundreds of terrorists in exchange for 1 or 2 of our soldiers. The Jibril agreement was a prisoner exchange, which took place in 1985, as you can see in the footnote, between the Israeli government, then headed by Shimon Peres, and the PLO. Israel released 1,150 security prisoners held in Israeli prisons in exchange for 3 Israeli prisoners. There are their names, captured during the First Lebanon War in 1982. So 3 years later, there was this exchange, which even to this day, by the way, continues to tear at the soul of the nation, with people in agreement with the deal on one side and people in disagreement on the other. especially considering the fact that the released terrorists return to resume murdering our soldiers and civilians. On the other hand, this rabbi writes, what value do 100 degenerate, contemptible terrorists have in comparison to one of our soldiers in captivity whose life is more precious than 100 of theirs? How can this exchange be considered more than their value? Is a terrorist to be considered of equal value to one of our soldiers? Now we get to his conclusion. This exchange cannot be included in the concept of their value. This is particularly true given the tradition in the IDF never to abandon even one prisoner of war, and an entire battalion is put at risk to save one prisoner from the enemy. This is the feeling that guides the Israeli soldier who never despairs while in captivity because he is secure in the knowledge that we will come to his rescue at any price. After all, as our emissary, he embarked on a mission to fight to protect our country and to secure our lives. It is as though we made a sacred promise that we will never abandon or forsake him under any circumstances. So that's the last of the texts that I wanted to share with you today. Again, no answers, but I hope that today we've provided a window into significant halakhic thought from Mishnah 2,000 years ago to Talmud 1,500 years old to Maimonides 800 years old to texts that were written in the last 40 years on exactly this subject. Let's hear one or two final comments. Rob and Aaron, you've got your hand up, so I'm going to give you the ability to chime in since you're the one who really brought us to the elephant in the room in the first place.
I think what would be helpful to answer this question is asking the hostages that have been released what they would have preferred, what they think about it. Has anyone ever done that?
I'm sure they have. And we probably, I mean, God willing, we'll be able to have interviews with the hostages. And imagine you may have different points of view.
Sure. I just wonder.
Yeah, Gilad Shalit has been interviewed, and you can see his interviews on YouTube. I don't know, though.
Because I would imagine some soldiers would be willing to make that sacrifice.
And say, this was a risk I took on knowingly as an Israeli. I was going to say, not when I enlisted in the IDF. That's not the deal. The deal is that from the time a child is able to understand, and I'm excluding those communities in Israel that exclude themselves from serving the Jewish state in war, including the Haredi, the ultra Orthodox, who by and large do not serve in war. Not all, but most. But the vast majority of Israeli citizens who are Jewish, not its Arab citizens, by the way, who identify with the Palestinian people and in many cases identify with the Palestinian cause. Yes, this is complicated. But 4 out of 5 Israelis who are Jewish, the vast majority of them grow up from the time they're old enough to understand. They understand that as soon as high school's over, they're going into the army. That is what it is to be an Israeli. And I believe you're right, Aaron, that some will probably come back and say, this is the deal we make. And I recognize that, I would not want to do anything to further jeopardize my people and my country. And there will probably be others who say, no, the deal is when you're in the IDF, you feel secure that your brothers and sisters in arms will do everything and the state will do everything in its power to bring you back home. Both of these are true, by the way, without a clear...
I'm sure.
So my friends, here's what I'd like to say by way of concluding. First of all, thank you. I'm reformatting the content of our fall class. I'll be back with more reliable Wi-Fi in New York for next week's class, coming back in a couple days. Right now, all of the texts we're going to be looking at will comment on the war and the crisis from different angles. So today, redeeming captives, but there are a lot of other lessons I have teed up. I just have to do a little bit of extra lesson prep. But thank you so much. I'm so grateful that we are all in this together. Please come to services Friday night. The Jewish community needs you there. If you feel comfortable coming in person, we have augmented our security posture, both in-house and with our wonderful partners in local law enforcement. Scarsdale Police and Department has been amazing. we're going to have an incredible opportunity on Sunday to have a dialogue over Zoom at 1:30 p.m. with Rabbi Nir Barkin. The details are in this morning's e-blast, so please pay attention because you can register for that Zoom. We want the whole community to show up. Rabbi Barkin is the senior rabbi of Kilat Yozma, one of our sister congregations in Israel. They use the Torah scroll that WRT donated in 2007. He is a dear friend, and he's going to share how he and his community are responding to the war. And it's going to be heart-wrenching and inspiring at the same time. And there will also be invitations for how our community can directly assist. So you won't want to miss that. It's a no more than 1 hour, 1:30 p.m. on Sunday. You can register through the link in today's e-blast. And then next week, mark your calendars for Thursday and Friday and Saturday morning, when author, educator, and comedian, yes, comedian Joel Chasnoff, who made Aliyah with his family from New Rochelle to Israel 7 years ago, will be in residence with us as author, educator, and yes, comedian. Thursday night, he's going to do a performance and dialogue. Friday night, he's with us at services and will speak. Saturday morning, we're doing a congregation-wide service in the round, and he's going to be amazing. So send you only my blessings. Stay strong and in touch. Israel. Thanks,
Jonathan, thank you so much for bringing Talmud, Midrash, and all of it into the present day.
Toda rabba.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks again, John, and everybody stay safe and well.
Everyone
and
stay
take
well.
care.
And please stay connected. We need you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Safe trip home.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
God bless.